Hi everybody, welcome to Scarpad's Comic Trek, where we talk about Star Trek comics throughout the years. We try to take a look at them and shed some light on them. And today we're going back to the year 1996, which is the 30th anniversary of Star Trek. And about 20 years ago, 30 years ago, we got about 50 years of comics now. But what we're looking at today is the first comic from a collaboration of Marvel and Paramount Comics. Now, in 1996, the license belonged to DC, who was creating, several volumes of very successful comics, and Malibu, who were also putting out some comics on their own. They lost that license. Marvel reacquired it and got into a merge with Paramount Comics. And under that split, they brought out several titles, including the Star Trek Early Voyages comic, the Starfleet Academy comic, and a series based on Star Trek Voyager. Now, that merger would only last about 2 years. And after that merger, the license went to Wildstorm, which was a division of DC, who created comics for several years. But the very first result of this merger between Marvel and Paramount would be the comic that we're looking at today. And that comic would be Star Trek X-Men. It was a 64-page book written by Scott Lobdell and inked, and the artists, there was a whole flotilla. I think about maybe 20 different artists and colorists worked on this book. And they worked on different pages, so that when we're going over the book and you're looking at it, you can definitely see different styles. So in the way of artwork, it didn't really gel so much. But the story was fantastic. And I think the X-Men was the perfect property to bring to Star Trek Comics. Now, since then, with IDW, we've had collaborations between the crew of the Enterprise and the Transformers, also Green Lantern, and the Legion of Superheroes. But where I think X-Men really shined was that the whole idea behind the X-Men of the 60s through the 90s was this idea of being outsiders and fighting for the rights of the mutant brotherhood. And Star Trek has that optimism to it, where it has a respect for all life and all types of life. And you'll see in this comic where that comes into play. And I thought they did an excellent job of going back into Star Trek canon and pulling out characters and a story that would merge seamlessly in with the idea of the X-Men. So let's go ahead and take a look at this comic. The tale starts out on the Enterprise with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, as it often does. And they've been sent to investigate waves of psionic energy that are now surrounding the planet of Delta Vega. And any Star Trek fan will remember that Delta Vega was the planet that the Enterprise crew visited in the second pilot, Where No Man Has Gone Before, that told the tale of a crewman, Kirk's friend, Gary Mitchell, being inhabited by a godlike force from the barrier at the edge of the galaxy. And throughout that tale, Kirk has to come to terms with the fact that he's going to ultimately have to maroon his friend on a deserted planetoid and possibly kill him because the power that lies within Gary Mitchell is corrupting him and he's becoming an omnipotent villain who's going to take over the galaxy. And at the end of that tale, Kirk does indeed trap and ultimately kill Gary Mitchell on Delta Vega. So they went back to this tale for this comic. So the Enterprise is dispatched to Delta Vega to try to figure out what this wave of psionic energy is. And Kirk presumes rightly that it's more than likely something going on with Gary Mitchell, that he's now ultimately dead and maybe he's back. And when they arrive there, they find the planetoid and they find a ship that's orbiting the planet. I have no idea what that ship is. Looks like a giant cockroach. So when they go to investigate and contact the ship suddenly blows up before they can even tell what the ship is. Spock does a scan and discovers there's 7 inhabitants on that ship, but they're dead. They're gone. And then another ship that looks distinctly like a Romulan warbird, but that was, before, that, well, that's what it looks like here, but it's not, appears. And a being appears to them called Gladiator. And Gladiator is being dispensed on a mission. And he's going to stop the Enterprise crew any way he can. In the process of that happening, I love that scene where basically it reminds me of the second season episode, Whom Gods Destroy, Who Mourns for Adonis, where Apollo seizes the Enterprise. Definitely shouts back to that. And he grabs the Enterprise in his hands, and in doing so, affects the shields around the ship so that they're vulnerable and the shields are down. Now, unbeknownst to the Enterprise crew in the time that those shields were down, the 7 passengers from that ship were able to infiltrate the ship. And we find out for the first time that it's Wolverine. We see him first. And this was a classic era of X-Men where you're going to get really the main X-Men cast in all their glory. So Wolverine is observing and hiding in the ship and getting some basic information about what's going on here. He finds out the ship's called the Enterprise, and he finds out some of the crew's names when he's watching them. The rest of the X-Men cast is, of course, hiding. And, we get all the familiars here: Jean Grey, Gambit, Cyclops, Hank McCoy, the Beast. So the X-Men are trying to figure out what's going on here, and we get a scene where they're trying to deduce exactly where they are and what's going on. And Hank McCoy, of course, is being the inquisitive one, is discovering the fact that they're on a Constitution-class starship, and the year is 2245. In the future, some future, they don't know whether they're in an alternate universe or an alternate timeline or just, what's going on. And Jean Grey tries to send out a signal that is going to contact, to try to find out what's going on here on the ship. And because Spock is telepathic, he senses the contact of Jean Grey. So he heads off to investigate the situation. And in the meantime, Jean Grey is going to take Gambit to the sick bay, the medical facility, because he's injured. And when they go there, they find McCoy coming in. And of course, McCoy is perfect in these scenes. More concerned as a doctor than he is as a Starfleet officer of what's going on there. And I love this scene that we're getting in the corner here where Nurse Chapel comes in and she's asking, what should we, do, Dr. McCoy, and both Linda McCoy and Hank McCoy respond. I love that little scene in the bottom where they're looking at each other. It's fantastic. So, meanwhile, we get the meeting of Spock and the X-Men. And this is a fantastic scene because, of course, any good X-Men book is going to have a fight. And when you're in the Star Trek universe, what can you really do? I mean, who are you going to fight? Because the X-Men can kick everybody's ass, including Captain Kirk. So, of course, you're going to put him up against Mr. Spock, where you have the perfect balance of his strength and his mind. And who's going to fight him? Yeah, who do you expect? Wolverine. So Wolverine goes into battle Spock, and Spock promptly applies the Vulcan neck pinch. Doesn't affect Wolverine, though. So Wolverine's coming back even more fit for bear. But when they discover they're pretty much equals, he wants to be taken to their leader, and he wants to see the captain. And the captain's coming out of the bridge, and he runs into Spock and the X-Men. And that's a great panel there where we have them all together. Meanwhile, on the enemy ship, we find out that we have a villain called Deathbird who's going to attempt to merge with the power on the planet. And on the planet itself, we're finding what we thought we would find, a reanimated Gary Mitchell. Now, not only the undead body of Gary Mitchell, but with a new entity called Proteus. And Proteus is a villain that's known to the X-Men that they've had several run-ins with the past. And we get a scene in the briefing room where they're getting the exposition of what's happening. They're on a mission dispatched to bring these people in, including Proteus and Deathbird, by Deathbird's sister. And we get really the best scene in the book here. And I'll talk about it a little bit. And of course, you're going to get it between Jean Grey and Captain Kirk. And the first thing Kirk does is put the old hit on Jean Grey. He's coming out with and you're quite an attractive mutant, aren't you? Of course, Jean promptly tells him that she's married to Scott, Cyclops. And Kirk goes, oh. So leave it to good Captain Kirk to put the moves on whoever he finds instantly. But the rest of the scene plays out very good because what it does is it talks about that crux of the X-Men where they're all for protecting mutant rights. And she tells Kirk after he talks about having to kill his friend Gary Mitchell, who's basically become a mutant. And she says, well, is that what you do? You kill mutants? And he goes, no, I didn't want to kill this mutant. We live in a society where everybody is regarded as something worthwhile. But people who become omnipotent and want to take over the galaxy, we can't have that. And she acknowledges that's where they stand as well. So it's a nice scene that kind of props up the relationship between the X-Men and the crew of the Enterprise and why this was a good mix as a comic book property to bring into Star Trek. So when they beam down to the planet, then they encounter the villains, Gary Mitchell, Deathbird, and the rest of the villains here. And, we get some good scenes between a reanimated Gary and Captain James Kirk. And we're finding out that on the Enterprise, Mr. Spock and Hank McCoy are coming up with a plan. And the plan is to use the tractor beam of the Enterprise to try to disable or remove the psionic force that's giving the power to Gary Mitchell and the other villains from the X-Men. They want to use the phasers because that's going to kill everybody in the area, but they want to use the psionic, the tractor beam to kind of remove that. But of course, we're going to get a battle before we can do that. The X-Men and Wolverine, of course, initiates a battle between the forces that's going to rage. Now, in the meantime, while that's going on, Kirk is going to ally himself with Jean Grey and try to get into the mind of his former friend, Gary Mitchell. And Mitchell's still feeling, left behind and betrayed. So he's able to distract Gary once again, like he did in the original pilot, long enough for Spock and Hank McCoy to launch their plan. And ultimately, that plan is successful. And because that energy's gone around the planet, Kirk can now dispatch Gary Mitchell. Once again, he has a choice to make, as he did in the original episode, to kill his friend. And with the X-Men, Chekhov, Uhura, and the rest of the Starfleet crew, they basically vaporized Gary Mitchell. And Gary Mitchell is dead now, for once, which is leaving just Proteus and Deathbird and the other X-Men villains behind. And as I stated before in the beginning, that because different artists and inkers worked on this book on the various pages, because it was a 30th anniversary book, that we're getting different styles. And you can see that here, the rendering of the Enterprise isn't all that great, and it's a lot different than what we saw earlier in the book. So after they vaporize the psionic layer inhabiting the planet, Kirk is furiously looking for his friend, and McCoy tells him that he's gone, and perhaps now he can get some rest. Back on the Enterprise, we're getting a scene between Kirk and Cyclops where they state that, this is a future that they can aspire to, that the X-Men want this future to happen, so that all mutant kind and all of its kind are safe, protected, and respected. And Kirk is basically saying, well, yeah, that's what we do here. That's who we are. We're the Federation. And that's why this book, I think, ultimately succeeds, because you see that the optimism of Star Trek and the mission of the X-Men come together, and it really makes for a nice story. And, of course, the final splash page goes where every Star Trek comic and episode should go, back onto the bridge of the Enterprise for a little wrap-up with Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, saying that Spock says he has hope for the human race now, and of course everybody but McCoy. They get into an argument, and Kirk says, well, where do you want to go now? Chekhov says, where do you want to go now? To the captain, he says, to the future. And that's the end of the tale. So that's the X-Men and Star Trek. I think Marvel was really smart to bring this book out for the 30th anniversary of Star Trek, and as the first issue of the new run of Star Trek comics, which ultimately would only last a couple years and would be up and down. Starfleet Academy was okay. The Voyager comic I never really got into, but I want to do a reread of it and hopefully do a review of some of the issues here. The Early Voyagers was a fantastic comic that detailed the early voyages of Pike and the crew of the Enterprise. And unfortunately, after a year with this license, Paramount decided that they didn't want any of the comics licensed that didn't just contain the crews of the shows currently on TV or were on TV. So they didn't want Starfleet Academy. They didn't want the early Voyagers, and unfortunately, that led to both those titles, which were in the middle of runs, just to be canceled. So early Voyagers and Starfleet Academy never ended their runs, which is a shame because they were doing well and they were selling well and they were at the top of their game, and they got the plug pulled. And then ultimately a year later, they would lose a license altogether, and the license would then go to Wildstorm for several years prior to IDW getting the license in 2007. So that's a look here at the first comic book from Marvel Paramount. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you've learned something from it. I hope you will pick the book up if you like what you saw here and read it, because it's an entertaining read. If you're an X-Men fan, if you're a Star Trek fan, definitely worth picking up. I know it's available digitally in trade, and you can find the comic around. It's not hard to find. So I thank everybody for watching this video. If you like it and you want to tell your friends about it, that would be fantastic. Don't forget to subscribe if you like what you're seeing here for content, and share it. And once again, as we always say at the end of all these videos, keep reading and keep on trekking.